But during these times that he was a guest at Windsor Castle at Sandringham, the shooting weekend, we now know that he was and had been procuring young girls for sex trafficking.
We now know that. At the time, there was no indication to me or anybody else that that was what he was doing.
More than 100 pages of court records have just been unsealed. One name appears again and again: Prince Andrew. This is not rumor, not speculation, not whispers from back rooms. According to court records, the documents originate from proceedings before a United States federal court, statements given under oath, flight logs, schedules, names, dates, locations. The unsealed documents show that the name of a member of the British royal family does not appear casually. It appears repeatedly. The numbers are stark. Precisely for that reason, they are disturbing. Within the released files, dozens of connections emerge between a convicted offender and individuals from politics, business, and aristocratic circles. Multiple references point to travel, meetings, and visits that can be clearly placed in time, not once, not by accident, but in patterns. The crucial point is this: these details do not come from tabloid headlines. They come from sworn testimony, from flight logs, from documents examined within federal legal proceedings. When records exist in such form, denial becomes difficult to sustain. When movements are documented, claims of uncertainty face an uncomfortable contrast. For the British monarchy, the implications extend far beyond reputational damage. The institution depends on trust, on the belief that proximity to power does not mean proximity to moral collapse. Yet the documents force a question that cannot be ignored. What happens when the same names associated with honor and tradition appear within files tied to a system built on secrecy? The issue here is not whether these records exist. They do. The question is why they remained sealed for so long, and who benefited from that silence. Systems built on discretion often rely on time to dilute attention, but once records are opened, time no longer protects them. What begins here is not simply a scandal. It is a test for individuals, for institutions, and for a monarchy that must confront whether honor still carries meaning when evidence speaks and silence remains. The records outline a clear timeline: 1999 to 2010. Years in which paths crossed, meetings repeated, and decisions accumulated. According to court records, the connection between Prince Andrew and Jeffrey Epstein did not emerge by coincidence. The introduction came through Ghislaine Maxwell, whose social network moved comfortably through elite circles in both Britain and the United States. Invitations followed. Visits followed. A relationship formed that appeared, at least publicly, to be part of the ordinary world of high society connections. Then came a turning point. Epstein's first criminal conviction became public record. It was a moment when distance might have been expected, yet the unsealed documents show that the association did not immediately end. According to court records, Andrew continued to appear in connection with Epstein's residences and social environment, even after that conviction had already raised serious questions about Epstein's activities. This is where the contradiction becomes unavoidable. The issue is not a meeting that occurred before information was widely known. The issue is proximity after warnings had already surfaced. Members of a royal household are trained to assess reputational risk with extreme caution. Public image is not incidental to the institution. It is the institution, yet the timeline in the record suggests decisions that ignored those risks rather than avoided them. Prince Andrew later stated publicly that he did not recall certain encounters described by witnesses. But Andrew says he does not remember. The flight records tell a different story. According to court documents, detailed logs exist for multiple journeys aboard Epstein's private aircraft, often referred to in media reports as the Lolita Express. Dates, routes, passenger manifests. These documents do not rely on memory. They rely on records created at the time of travel. Another element became central to the controversy: Virginia Giuffre provided testimony, describing her encounters within Epstein's network. Among the materials discussed in legal proceedings was a photograph taken in London that appeared to place Andrew in proximity to Giuffre during the period in question. The image became widely circulated and intensely debated, though its significance has remained part of ongoing legal and public discussion. The contrast between institutional image and documented associations grew sharper with each new disclosure. On one side stands Buckingham Palace, a symbol of continuity, discipline, and ceremonial authority. On the other side stand private residences and private flights, environments removed from public scrutiny. The question raised by the documents is not merely about personal judgment. It concerns the boundaries between private relationships and public responsibility. In institutions built on hierarchy and tradition, reputation functions as a form of power. When that reputation becomes entangled with controversy, the damage spreads outward. The records do not provide every answer, but they create a framework that demands explanation. Each confirmed journey, each documented visit, weakens the narrative that the relationship was incidental or insignificant. The deeper issue is structural. Systems of influence often operate on loyalty and discretion. Warnings may exist, yet they remain unspoken. Distances that should be enforced remain blurred. According to court records, opportunities to sever ties existed long before the story reached global headlines. Those opportunities were not always taken. The betrayal, therefore, is not defined solely by any single action. It lies in the erosion of trust that follows when proximity to power appears to override caution. Institutions survive on credibility. Once that credibility fractures, every document becomes heavier, every silence more difficult to justify. Jeffrey Epstein did not merely trade in influence. According to court records, he dealt in something far more valuable within elite circles. Information. Not ordinary information, but compromising situations, private encounters, and moments that were never meant to become public knowledge. His most powerful currency was not money or property. It was the possibility of exposure. The unsealed documents show that many interactions inside Epstein's world followed a pattern. Meetings took place in private settings, often removed from conventional oversight. Guests moved through spaces designed for comfort and discretion. Yet testimony from former employees and witnesses suggests that these environments were not simply private. They were monitored. Statements reference the presence of cameras placed discreetly throughout certain properties. Not openly, not as security measures visible to guests, but as tools capable of recording what occurred behind closed doors. The center of this network was Little Street James, Epstein's private island in the Caribbean. Isolated, difficult to access, jurisdictionally complex. According to court records, the island functioned less like a retreat and more like a controlled environment. Those who arrived there entered a space where normal social boundaries dissolved, and where the possibility of documentation lingered in the background. This is where the mechanism of blackmail becomes easier to understand. Direct threats are rarely necessary when reputations are at stake. For political leaders, financiers, and members of aristocratic families, reputation can be more fragile than legal standing. Public image forms the foundation of influence. The fear of losing that image can be stronger than the fear of legal consequences. The unsealed documents suggest that Epstein understood this dynamic with unusual precision. Instead of demanding loyalty, he cultivated situations in which loyalty became the safest option. Individuals who might otherwise distance themselves could instead become cautious. Silence became preferable to confrontation. Distance became complicated. In such an environment, the balance of power shifts quietly. Influence no longer depends solely on wealth or status. It depends on who holds information capable of reshaping public narratives. The threat does not need to be spoken. The mere existence of potential evidence is enough. Why were members of elite circles particularly vulnerable? Because their power depends on perception. Titles, political authority, and social prestige rely heavily on credibility. According to court records, Epstein's network appears to have exploited precisely that vulnerability. When reputation becomes leverage, silence becomes a form of protection. The structure that emerges from the documents is not simply a criminal enterprise. It resembles an ecosystem of secrets. Each participant, knowingly or unknowingly, helps sustain it. Those who speak risk personal and professional collapse. Those who remain silent maintain stability, at least temporarily. What the records reveal is not merely misconduct, but a method. A system that transformed private behavior into strategic leverage. In that system, control did not come from open power. It came from the quiet accumulation of secrets. And once those secrets existed, they shaped decisions far beyond the walls where they were first created. The British monarchy often presents itself as a moral compass, a symbol of continuity, of discipline, of values that stand above individual behavior. Yet, according to court records, the Epstein affair exposes an uncomfortable contradiction. It raises a question not only about individuals, but about how moral standards are applied inside the institution itself. To understand the depth of this contradiction, one must look back at the treatment of Diana. When Diana began stepping beyond the rigid boundaries expected by the royal household, the response from the institution was swift. Independence was viewed as instability. Openness toward the media was interpreted as risk. The palace moved quickly to protect its authority and image. Titles, privileges, and public roles became subjects of negotiation and control. Diana's struggle was framed as a personal crisis, yet the institutional reaction revealed something deeper. The monarchy protects its structure first. Anyone who challenges that structure risks isolation. In Diana's case, her growing autonomy and willingness to speak openly about her experiences disrupted the carefully managed image of royal life. The institution reacted defensively, prioritizing order over empathy. The Epstein controversy casts that history in a different light. In the case of Prince Andrew, the response followed a noticeably different rhythm. The unsealed documents show that allegations and testimonies connected to Epstein circulated publicly for years. Witness statements, flight logs, and legal filings created mounting pressure. Yet the institutional reaction remained cautious, gradual, and protective. This contrast is what fuels public frustration. When Diana's behavior threatened the image of the monarchy, consequences appeared rapidly. When questions emerged surrounding Andrew's associations, the reaction unfolded slowly, often framed as a matter of personal circumstance rather than institutional accountability. According to court records, the timeline of disclosures surrounding Epstein and his network stretched across many years before major public consequences for Andrew took shape. Throughout that period, the palace maintained distance without immediate rupture. Statements were measured, responses controlled. The institution appeared to manage the crisis rather than confront it directly. This pattern echoes earlier moments in royal history. Consider the experience of Frances Shand Kidd, whose personal choices once placed her at odds with aristocratic expectations. Women who stepped outside the prescribed framework often faced swift social marginalization. Their autonomy was treated as instability, their independence as disruption. The comparison is difficult to ignore. Freedom invited discipline. Controversy connected to power invited patience. This perception matters because monarchy depends on legitimacy. Unlike elected governments, it survives through public belief in its moral authority. If that authority appears selective, the foundation weakens. A system that claims to represent duty and honor cannot easily explain why similar standards do not apply to every member within it. The shadow of Diana lingers because it symbolizes a deeper tension between image and accountability. Her story remains powerful precisely because it revealed how fragile compassion can become inside rigid institutions. The Epstein affair reawakens that memory. It reminds observers that reputations are protected differently depending on who holds them. In the public imagination, these two narratives now intersect. One concerns a princess whose independence unsettled tradition. The other concerns a prince whose associations raised questions about judgment and responsibility. The contrast forces a difficult reflection. When institutions defend themselves, do they protect principles, or do they protect power? For many observers, that question remains unresolved. And as long as it remains unanswered, the shadow cast by past injustices continues to stretch across the present. The Epstein files are not simply another scandal in the long history of public controversy. According to court records, they represent something deeper, a moment when documents forced institutions to confront the limits of their own narratives. What once existed as rumor or speculation now appears within sworn testimony, legal filings, and officially released records. The difference is decisive. Allegations may fade, documents endure. The unsealed documents show that warnings existed long before the full scale of the story became visible. Witness accounts, investigative reporting, and legal proceedings accumulated gradually over time. Yet decisive institutional responses often came later, sometimes years after the earliest concerns had surfaced. In that delay lies the core of the crisis. Monarchies do not rely on elections. They rely on credibility. Their authority comes from the belief that tradition represents stability and moral continuity. When that belief begins to fracture, the damage cannot be repaired through ceremony or public relations. It requires trust, and trust, once weakened, is difficult to restore. The Epstein case forces a broader reflection about how power responds to scrutiny. If influence creates distance from accountability, public confidence inevitably declines. Institutions that once appeared untouchable begin to face the same questions directed at every other center of authority. Transparency becomes unavoidable. Silence becomes unsustainable. For the British monarchy, the challenge is therefore not only legal or reputational, it is historical. Every generation of the institution claims to embody responsibility and duty, yet responsibility also demands that uncomfortable questions be faced openly. Avoidance may protect individuals temporarily, but it rarely protects institutions in the long term. The Epstein records remain part of the public archive now. They will be examined, discussed, and debated for years to come. Their significance extends beyond the individuals named within them. They reflect a turning point in how authority itself is judged. And perhaps that is the most important conclusion of all. Justice may arrive late, but once files are opened, they cannot be closed again. So the question now belongs not to courts, but to the public. What level of accountability should power accept when evidence enters the historical record?